If memory serves correctly, we are picking up in Matthew chapter 5 at verse 38. I intended to go back and look at our last video to confirm that, and I neglected to do that. So you all tell me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that's where we are ready to pick up. So let's take just a minute to, since it's been a couple of weeks since our last study, to just remind ourselves where we are in the course of the sermon. Because one of the things that I think it's easy to do in any Bible study, and especially when you're doing a textual study and just working through the text of the study, um, the text that you're studying verse by verse, as it were. Um, I think one of the things that is easy to do is to, in some ways, overly dissect the text. Um, to, as we sometimes say, lose the forest for the trees. And I think that is particularly true with the Sermon on the Mount. I may have relayed this to you before, and pardon me if I'm repeating something, but several years ago, um, well, more than several, uh, a preacher friend of mine who's my age at the time, we were both in our early 20s, so that tells you it's been a while. Very new to preaching. We were talking about the Sermon on the Mount, and he said that his dad told him that a preacher had gotten up and preached through the whole Sermon on the Mount in one sermon. And his comment to his dad, he's telling this story on himself. His comment to his dad was, "Wow, I don't think I could do that." And his dad's comment was, "Well, Jesus did." Um, and and that was kind of a humbling experience for my friend, and it was a good reminder to me that this was one sermon. Now, admittedly, there's a lot in it, and there's a lot for us to talk about, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we do need to remember that Jesus is presenting a sermon, that it is a unified whole. And we don't need to lose sight of that and the overall picture that um, that Jesus is communicating. And so, if I go back and I review and I repeat myself about the structure, I'm doing that because I don't want us to lose the unified whole of the sermon. Does that make sense to everybody? Do you understand where I'm going with that? Okay. So, obviously, um, the sermon starts with the Beatitudes, and not just the Beatitudes, but down through the first 19 verses of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is talking about the character of the kingdom. These are the foundations. These are the fundamental qualities and characteristics of heart that are true of a kingdom citizen. And in many ways, what Jesus establishes there are the prerequisites. In other words, these have to come first. Before we can dig into some of the nitty gritty behaviors and application, we've got to talk about we've got to talk about having the right heart before we can talk about the right behavior. And in some ways, that is what um, that's kind of one of the themes of the sermon, if you will, because as we know, when Jesus says, "Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees," that's Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20. Part of the problem with the righteousness of the Jews in his day, and particularly the Jewish elite, the Jewish leadership, was that they were about precise wording of the law and making sure that they got the little nooks and crannies of what was being said. But then they thought, well, basically I can think any way I want as long as I get the formula right, as long as I get the action right. And Jesus starts with the heart behind the action. The action's important, but Jesus says so is the heart. So, so again, the first 19 verses of Matthew 5 are the character. And then beginning with verse 20 that I've already alluded to, Jesus teaches by way of contrast. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you, here's the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. I'm telling you, you need a greater righteousness than that. Then starting with chapter 6, we get into prescriptions of conduct, where Jesus is just teaching directly, do this, don't do that. And then he closes the sermon starting about halfway through Matthew chapter 7 with a call to respond to what he's been teaching. So I review all of that just to remind you that where we are in Matthew 5, verse 38 at the moment is we are still in what I'm calling contrast part of the sermon, where Jesus is calling a contrast between what they've heard and what God really expects. Where he's calling a contrast between what they're being taught in the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees with what God really expects, the exceeding righteousness, the righteous that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. So what does that look like? Well, so far we have talked about you've heard that it was said you shall not commit murder, but I say to you that someone who's angry with his brother is guilty. That's verses 21 through 26. Verse 27, adultery versus lust. And then that naturally then leads into a discussion of divorce and remarriage. And that connects to this principle regarding vows of being faithful to the word that we speak. All right. Anybody have any question or comment down to that point, just as we've reviewed? Hey, I want credit. I did that in under 10 minutes. Anybody have any question or comment as we've reviewed before we get into new material tonight? All right. So, Tom, if you will, would you read for us tonight?
Sure.
Matthew 5, start verse 38 and go through verse 42, please.
Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Go to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away.
Okay. So Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. As far as that quotation goes, is that an accurate statement of the law of Moses?
Yes.
Yes, it is. And that's something we need to make sure that we don't miss in this. Is that as far as the statements go, Jesus isn't saying, no, that's not what the law says. What he's saying is, you are misunderstanding, misapplying what the law says. And so, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The text of the law actually did say that. So is Jesus saying that the law is wrong?
No.
Okay. explain that, Alan. Then why would Jesus say, "You've heard that it was said, but I say to you"?
Actually, what he's indicating is the remedy. The judgment could be used under the law, but it does not mean it was necessarily required.
Yeah, I think you're getting feedback. You're logged in twice somehow, so I think that was some feedback.
Sorry.
That's okay. All right, so that's right. The principle of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is in fact the law of Moses, but with the law, that was the standard for essentially judicial proceedings, not a standard by which you were allowed to take personal vengeance or personal retribution. And so what had been done was taking something that the law in fact said and turning it into a way, an excuse, if you will, to, from Jesus' perspective, abuse your fellow man. And Jesus said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth isn't a cloak for personal vengeance. It's not a cover for you to do to settle your own score or to mistreat someone who's mistreated you. It's the principle by which justice is administered according to the law. There were limits on that. It wasn't just it wasn't the wild, wild west where lawlessness reigned supreme and people could basically do what they wanted. Israel had that experiment during the period of the Judges, when every man did what was right in his own eyes. Jesus isn't advocating that in the least, but that's kind of what they turned this into. And so Jesus is bringing that principle and saying you've abused it. And so Jesus says, don't resist an evil person. He slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other. Anyone wants to sue you and take your garment, give him the rest of your clothing. He forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. Give if he asks, don't turn away from him who wants to borrow. And so there is this principle of going the extra mile. That principle, we use that expression ourselves, comes from the Roman context of this sermon, where by Roman law, a Roman soldier could compel a non-Roman to bear his burden, to carry his armor 1 Roman mile. And so the concept of mile markers, we see up and down the highway, up and down the interstate. Well, that's an ancient Roman concept. There are ancient Roman mile markers that are still in existence. And so Jesus says, you don't do just what you have to do, but you go the extra mile. And especially when you're talking about those who would abuse and mistreat you. This section of the sermon always makes me think of what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 12. And I'm trying to stay in the Sermon on the Mount, but I want to call attention to Romans chapter 12 just real quickly, because I wonder if Paul wasn't thinking about the sermon when he wrote Romans chapter 12. But Romans chapter 12, Paul wrote, beginning in verse 17, never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him a drink. for in so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's what I think we see here in this section of the sermon, and it continues into the next paragraph, the next contrast. But I want to pause for just a moment. Anybody have any questions or thoughts they want to share about that? All right. So again, the thought continues. Verse 43 through the end of chapter 5. So, Diana, would you be willing to read tonight? All right. Matthew 5, 43 through 48. Yes. Oh, yep. You all are going to have the same problem.
Sorry,
You're in
Greg.
the same room.
Sorry,
Just
Greg
one-
wasn't muted.
Yeah. Yeah. Greg, did you mute your audio for me?
Matthew 5, 43 through 48.
Yes, please.
Okay. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
All right. Thank you. So, again, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor. Accurate? Of course. That's a quotation from I just drew a complete blank. That's a quotation from Leviticus. Is what I'm trying to get to. Leviticus 19. But they had extended that to say, well, if you're supposed to love your neighbor, then that means it's okay to hate your enemy. And Jesus said, no, you got that wrong. You've added something that wasn't there. You have extrapolated upon the law in a way that's just not what God's trying to tell you. And so Jesus says, your enemies are your neighbors. Just because a person is your enemy doesn't mean they're not your neighbor. Your neighbor isn't just the people that you naturally love or naturally like. It's the story of the Good Samaritan, right? You've got what I think we can safely assume is a Jewish man who's beaten and robbed and left half dead. And for fear that I think, again, presumably, but I think safely, that they would be left unclean, that they would be defiled by caring for him, the priest and the Levite are willing to pass by on the other side of the road. But a Samaritan, someone that the Jew probably didn't like, and quite frankly, maybe the Samaritan really didn't like him especially either, was willing to love him, to do good for him. And so enemies are neighbors too. That's the principle that Jesus teaches. And so, verse 44, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Your enemies are your neighbors too. And so we have a responsibility to love them. What Jesus teaches in this passage is that love is not just an emotion. In fact, love isn't an emotion at its core. Love is first a decision that leads to action that generates emotion. And so love doesn't start with the emotion. Love starts with the decision that I'm going to love this person. I'm going to decide I'm going to love them. And that means I'm going to act on that decision. I'm going to do good. One Christian wrote his definition of Bible love as the selfless, active interest in the welfare of another. I really like that. Selfless, active interest in the welfare of another. And Jesus, I mean, that's what Jesus teaches you. You make the decision and you act in their best interest. And if the emotion follows, that's fine. And often it does. It doesn't necessarily have to. You might still struggle to like someone in the way that we sometimes talk about. That they might make it difficult on you in some way. That doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to love them in the decisions you make, the actions you take. And so you act in a loving way, even if they're not going to reciprocate. Love doesn't require both people. Love requires a decision that you make and actions you take. And so, what's the end goal here? Why do we love our enemies? Why do we treat our enemies even like our neighbors? Why do we do that? What does Jesus say we're trying to accomplish here?
You're to be the
Like
children.
Wow. Okay. All right.
The children of your Father which is in heaven.
Yeah. The goal is to be like God. That's the goal. To as children, emulate the character of our Father. That's the goal. And so he's the one who causes the sun to rise on both the evil and good. He's the one who sends rain on the righteous and unrighteous. If you just greet your neighbors, if you just let's see, how does he say it? If you only love those who love you, if you greet only your brethren, what difference are you than tax collectors and sinners and Gentiles? What's different from between you and those who don't operate according to principles of godliness at all? There's really nothing to distinguish you in this realm. Jesus said the goal is to be like God. And I'll tell you, one of the most humbling and one of the highest challenges I think Jesus issues in the entire sermon is in this section when he says in verse 48, you're to be perfect even as your heavenly Father is perfect. Your love is to be complete, is to be perfect, is to be all encompassing, not just pick and choose where we like it and want it, but like God himself. Our enemies are our neighbors too. And we need to act like it. So when Jesus says, the first great commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is likened to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. In that second great commandment, he's calling on us to be like our Father. He's calling on us to love everyone, even our enemies. All right. Question, complaint, criticism, comment, thoughts? Okay. So beginning with Matthew chapter 6, and of course you know this, but I'll remind you, of course, the chapter and verse divisions are completely human imposition, and in this case, somewhat unfortunate because they chop up a sermon. But beginning with chapter 6, verse 1, we begin what, at least in my nickel outline of the sermon, is the third section, and that is the section on conduct, where Jesus is very directly um, enjoining certain behaviors and condemning others, where he's not teaching by way of contrast, but he's just saying do this and don't do that. And that's a very vague and ineloquent way to describe this section. But you all know I like alliteration, so so character, contrast, conduct, and we'll get to the call. So again, Jesus is just saying, do this and don't do that. That's not in any way to separate this section from the rest of the teaching that he's been doing, because he's still saying your righteousness needs to be elevated to a higher plane, right? So going all the way back to chapter 5, verse 20, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. We're still looking at surpassing righteousness, righteousness that excels. That's what we're talking about. So chapter 6, verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. This is the keynote of the first 18 verses of Matthew chapter 6. Jesus is condemning righteousness practiced before men to be noticed by men, and righteousness that, if you will allow this, to be noticed by God, right? And so that's the keynote. And he then proceeds to illustrate what he's talking about to examples or manifestations of this righteousness, both before men and before God. So, Gregory, how about reading for us tonight? Matthew chapter 6, verses 2, 3, and 4, please, sir.
Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you.
Okay, so you have the discussion of, as the King James Version says, giving alms or doing alms, ALMS. Excuse me. The New King James refers to charitable deeds. The New American Standard, the English Standard, just talk about giving. And so the giving that's under discussion here is not the giving that, when we hear giving, sometimes our minds just automatically go to first day of the week laying by in store. That's certainly an important element of giving, but Jesus here is addressing a specific kind of giving. I think the principle would apply to our first day of the week giving, but Jesus here is talking about charitable giving, doing alms, giving to those where there is a need. We might call it benevolent giving, where we're showing compassion, generosity. We're expressing our love for our fellow man by some kind of material gift. Okay, so Jesus says, when you give to the poor, don't call attention to it. Make sure everybody knows. Jesus uses hyperbole in the sermon, and he certainly does here. Don't sound a trumpet before you. Now, whether or not that was literally being done, I've heard arguments both on both sides of that, and I'm not really interested in getting into that for the purpose of this discussion. But whether literally or metaphorically, it doesn't matter. You're not calling attention to what you're doing. That's the point. That's what the hypocrites do, because they want the attention and favor of man. Look at me. Look how generous I am. Look how good I am. Look how righteous I am. That was what was going on. And Jesus said, that misses the point. You're looking for the benefit in that case, not looking to give the benefit to others. It's self-serving, not serving others. Remember, love is selfless, active interest in the welfare of another person, not yourself. And so almsgiving, almsdoing, giving to the poor, they turned what was supposed to be a selfless act to benefit someone else into something that was calling attention and benefiting them. And Jesus said, you got that all kinds of inside out backwards. That is not what it is about. Jesus said, if you're calling attention to yourself in the process, you have your full reward. That's all you're going to get. You get the attention of men, the praise of men. That's it. Congratulations. You've reached your reward. That's it. Jesus said, if you want the favor of God, then your left hand doesn't even know what your right hand is doing. Now, that's obvious hyperbole. That's obvious exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. But that emphasizes the quietness with which Jesus says this ought to be done. You just go about doing it without attempting to call attention to it. Nobody else has to know. Nobody else needs to know. It's between you and God and maybe the person you're blessing. They don't even have to know what's coming from you. The point is that almsgiving is righteousness between you and God. He's the one who will be the judge of that. And so, because he sees in secret, he'll reward you. And as we'll see, some will say, some translations say, he'll reward you openly. There and the idea is that there will be no doubt about God's favor, about God's blessing when that time comes. But it's not your job to solicit that reward, to solicit that favor from men. It's your job just to do what's right. Okay. Any comments, questions about that? All right, I'm actually going to put a pin in it there. We have about 4.5 minutes left tonight, but I don't want to break up the next section because we're going to be talking about prayer, and I don't want to stop in the middle of that. There's no way for us to really talk about that in 4 minutes time. So I'm going to put a pin in our study for now. We'll stop there and we'll resume with Matthew 6 verse 5 on Lord willing next Wednesday night. So thank you all for studying with me. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry that we didn't get to study together last Wednesday night, but I'm really glad that we're able to resume this, and I look forward to seeing you. Perhaps seeing you in person on Sunday. If that doesn't happen, then I will plan still, hopefully, to do the Zoom study on Sunday night. So I'll see you then, and then next Wednesday night by Zoom, one way or the other. So again, thanks for joining us. Thanks for studying with me. I appreciate your patience and your interest in this. And as long as their interest, we're going to keep doing it. So you all have a great rest of the week. Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.
All right,
Thanks.
Jeremy.
Y'all stay safe and warm.
Thank you.